Hi students, it's your piano teacher Tim here, and in this lesson I'm going to teach you about 9 rhythm patterns that are going to show up in your music all the time, especially as a beginner. And I'm going to start out by teaching the basics of how to count rhythm. So if you know the basics like time signatures and that the quarter note gets one beat, go to here in the lesson, which is where we're going to begin our first rhythm pattern. The first thing I'm going to teach you right off the bat are the different types of what we call note durations you're going to have to be aware of. And note durations is how long you're holding the note. This is a quarter note and it gets one beat. So you're going to play the piano and just count 1. This is a half note and it gets 2 counts. 1, 2. This is a dotted half note. The dot adds half of the note's value back to itself. So if the half note's worth 2, half of 2 is 1. 2 plus 1 equals 3. 1, 2, 3. This is a whole note. You can tell right away because it's the only one that doesn't have some kind of stem attached to it. And this one, you play the piano and you count 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, the speed at which you count to 4, or whatever number you're counting to, is called the tempo. So you can go 1, 2, 3, 4 like that, and that's a fast tempo. A slow tempo would be 1, 2, 3, 4. And which tempo you're going to use depends on the style of piece that you're going to play, and usually they will tell you at the top of the page. If you take a look over here, I didn't mention this yet, but this thing is called the time signature. The top number of the time signature, especially as a beginner, is the most important to know because that's how many beats you're going to be able to fit into these things called measures. So if you notice, music is broken up into these boxes. Let me highlight one for you. I'll highlight the second one here. Into these boxes, and this is called a measure. Notice how there's a top space for the treble clef, what the right hand's going to play, and then we don't have anything written on the bass clef, but that's where you would play down with your left hand. They are actually counted, though, this is very important, at the same time. So if I had 4 quarter notes in the treble clef, 4 quarter notes in the bass clef, they would be counted at the same time and played at the same time, like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you ever want to know if beats line up at the same time, you can draw a vertical column with your mind. I wouldn't mark up your whole paper with it, but I like to think about things in vertical columns because that will tell you when things are supposed to hit at the exact same time. These are eighth notes or pairs of eighth notes, and they are each worth half of a beat. And one thing I want to tell you is notice how these are each beamed across. And in music, when notes are beamed together like that, 99% of the time, I know somebody's going to tell me the exception in the comments, but 99% of the time, they are beamed together to form one total beat. So we can see the 4 beats we have, 1, 2, 3, and 4 right there. We just have another note in between each of those beats. So we got to talk about how we count that. Here we have our 4 beats, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, we have to account for the other half, and we use this term called and. It looks like a plus sign. And the notes will actually be played twice as fast because you still need each of the 4 beats to hit where they would have before. 1, 2, 3, 4, but now we're double timing it as 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, just like that. This is a pairing of 16th notes. Notice there are 4 of them and they're beamed together. Therefore, all 4 of these is equal to 1 beat. So the question I have for you is, how many 16th notes, if there's 4 in 1 beat, can we fit in a whole measure of 4, 4? And the answer is 16. And that's because you have 4 beats in a measure and you have 4 notes for each beat. 4 times 4 is 16. Here we have our 4 beats that we had before, and I'm actually going to tell you this. We can actually add in the ands that we had before as well. Because if you keep in mind that now each of these 2 16th notes is actually equal to an 8th note, right? Since there's 4 in each beat, they're each worth a quarter of a beat. So therefore 2 of them would be worth half of a beat. So on each second half of these 16th notes, we're going to draw our and. The same thing as before. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now, we got to figure out, how do we account for the second half of the first part of the beat and the second half of the second half of the beat? And we use this term E and then on that last one. So 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and. And one thing you got to keep in mind, that these are 4 times as fast as you're playing your quarter notes. So if you're counting your quarter notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, your eighth notes will be 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. 16th notes, 2E and 3E and 4E and. So just make sure that when you're moving from quarters to eighths to 16th, that you're maintaining a consistent tempo, and we'll talk more about that later. And here's our first rhythm pattern. And you may be thinking, Tim, we just did this, but there's more things that I need to make you aware of. For example, that in 4/4, there is a natural accent on beats 1 and beat 3, with a stronger emphasis on beat 1. So I'm going to play this without any accents, and I'm going to play it with accents. And then I'm going to use a real piece of sheet music to share my point that I'm trying to make. So here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. But what I have written is 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. What is the purpose of this? Well, putting an accent on beat 1 and a smaller accent on beat 3 creates a moving along type of feeling, which is a lot better to listen to than just playing straight quarter notes. Here we have the first Gymno PD, and this piece happens to be in 3/4. 3/4 only has one accent in the whole measure, and that is just on beat 1. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Again, we create that accent to create a moving along feeling, and there's no better example than right here. So this is how I'm going to integrate what I'm teaching you into this piece. I know that the first beat has to be played with more emphasis and the other 2 beat with less emphasis. So here in the left hand, I have these notes being hit on beat 1. So when I'm playing, I'm going to hit that with more emphasis and the background chord with less emphasis, and it creates an interesting effect. By putting emphasis on beat 1, you can tell that it had more of a moving along feeling compared to that, which sounded just flat in comparison. The next pattern is another simple one, but it's something they're definitely going to be getting wrong because students get it wrong all the time. And the next pattern is moving from quarters into eighths to 16ths back to quarters. So here we have a rhythm, and you may be like, this is super easy, but I'm telling you right now, this is how most students will approach it. 1, 2, and 3 and 4 and like that. And it wasn't quite right because they just kind of winged it, right? A lot of students struggle going from quarters to eighths to 16ths to eighths. And how can we kind of solve this problem, right? Because we're going from longer notes and then, even shorter, and then kind of short. So here is how you're going to tackle this. And we're going to solve this problem by still subdividing the entire thing. And by the way, this is called subdivision, where you're going from quarters, 1, 2, 3, 4, to eighths, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and then 16ths, 1E and 2E and. So we are using what we call the 16th note subdivisions the entire time, even though we only have 16th notes right here. Now I drew these little lines to tell you how many of these syllables, the 16th note subdivisions, that each of these notes going to take up. So the quarter note is going to take up 1E and then 2E and 3E and 4E and. Now I'm going to try playing it. I'm going to count as evenly as I can, trying to only hold each note for its appropriate value. 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a. See how much more steady that was compared to just winging it? So the key is, are you listening? That when you have a piece, this is very important, and it has 1/16th note in the entire piece, even if it's like just the last measure or something, you want to subdivide the entire piece in your head, maybe out loud at first, in that 16th note subdivision. So when you get to that measure with the 16th note, you're already counting in that subdivision. If you're only counting eighth notes or quarter notes up to that point, you're going to be doing some guesswork once you get to the 16ths. So keep that 16th note subdivision. If you don't have any 16th notes in the whole piece and maybe only eighth notes, then you only need to do the eighth note subdivision, right? Even if you have only one eighth note in the whole piece, you still want to be counting 1 and 2 and 3 ands, so that when you do hit that eighth note, you're already counting in the correct subdivision. Got it? The next pattern is dotted quarter notes. And so we've talked about quarter notes, eighth notes, dotted half notes. Remember when I said dotted half note, what did I say? I said that the dot gives half of the note's value back to itself. So if we have a quarter note, how do we even approach that? Well, remember, if we only have a quarter note, which is worth 1 beat, we have a dot, which is half of the note's value, right? So 1 plus a half, right? That's half of 1, it's just a half. So 1 plus a half is 1.5. So a dotted quarter note gets 1.5. And how do we count that? Well, I just gave you the hint in the last thing that we did, and we're going to be using subdivisions. Now keep in mind that a dotted quarter note, right, gets 1.5 beats. And so you're not having to divide into 16th notes. So you can subdivide it by 16th notes, and maybe I'll do an example of that in a second, but you can get away just subdividing this one in eighth notes, and here's how you'll do it. Okay, I've drawn out the subdivision. One thing I would need you to keep in mind is that when you are subdividing into eighths, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, you are splitting the beat into 2 parts, which means, this is very important, the 1, the syllable, which is and, the 2, and, each of these things individually are half of a beat, right? So the question is, how many halves are in 1.5? And the answer is 3. So that's why I drew a line over 1 and 2. So it takes up 3 of those, right? With the last eighth note hitting on the last half of beat 2 hitting on the eighth note right here. So this is how you're going to count it. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now, how would you count this if you had to do it in 16th notes? So let's talk about the last 2 beats first, since those are easy, right? Those are quarter notes. They're just going to take up 3E and 4E and. We have the dotted quarter note. It takes up 1E and, which would be the quarter note. And then remember that the dot adds half of the beat value to itself, but we're in 16th, so you have to add 2 of the syllables, right? Since each of the syllables now, 1, E, and individually is quarter of a beat, right? So if it takes up 1.5 beats, it takes up all of 1 E and it actually takes up 2 E, with this eighth note hitting on and So each eighth note now gets 2 syllables, and a quarter note gets 4. So 3 and 4 E and. And here's how you'll count that: 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and. Now, why would you use this instead of the eighth notes? Well, say you had a 16th note in the following measure. Well, you're going to want to count these like this. If the rest of the piece only had eighth notes, then counting them in the eighth note subdivisions would be fine. Okay, so here we have the piece Silent Night. And if you ever need to remember how to count a dotted quarter note perfectly, just remember the beginning to Silent Night. Silent night, holy night. Excuse my terrible singing, but the rhythm of silent is that dotted quarter. Okay, the next type of rhythm is what we call a pickup note or a pickup measure. And I got to talk about how to count this, because a lot of students get this wrong. So we are in 4/4 time signature. How many beats per measure do we have? Well, 4, right? You can see them right in the bass clef right here. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and 4. But the problem is that we have this measure over here with a singular beat all on itself, and that's what we call a pickup measure. And the way you count a pickup measure is, see how there's one beat there? That's going to be the last beat of the measure, because think about it, it has to go back to beat 1, right? So that can't be beat 2, since we have 4 in a measure. It makes sense that that one's 4, right? Because it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So what you do, it's very easy. You just count this as 4, and then you're going to come in on 1, but there's a little bit more to it than that. You're going to count a whole measure first, and then come in on 4. So you're not going to go 4, 1. It works, but it doesn't set up a consistent tempo. It count a lot more sense to count out the full measure, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Just like that. And if you have trouble counting and playing all this at the same time, your best friend the next type of rhythm that's going to trip everybody up is known as the 8th quarter rhythm, which is going to shift over the beats a little bit. It's going to make things a little bit more interesting. Let's take a look. So we already know how to count out this measure with our 1 and 2 and 3 ands, right? We don't have any 16th notes. So let's do that. Now I have a question for you. What's weird about this measure? Well, all the other things we've been counting up until now, the quarter notes actually hit on a beat, but now they hit on all the pluses or all the ands, as you can tell. And that's going to cause, that's going to shift over the beats, which we call syncopation. You're going to hear it in types of like ragtime music, anything that uses syncopation. And I'll show you here in a second. But let's count out this rhythm first. I want to count it first as just 4 quarter notes, and then I want to play it the way it's written, right? So here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, and here it is. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Notice how it has like a boom, ba, 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 ba. Anytime you hear that type of thing, you're usually talking about syncopation. Like I said, used a lot in jazz or ragtime, things like that. In fact, the piece I just played had this rhythm in it. And it's right here in the first measure on beat 3. And notice how just by doing that, having the 8th quarter, the notes in the right hand now hit on the off beats with that quarter note up here hitting on the and of beat 3. And when played in context, it's going to have a nice syncopated rhythm sound like this. Here you can hear it. Ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It's not like right on the beat. I mean, here it is, but you can really hear where it kind of not falls apart, but it doesn't quite line up the way it does everywhere else. Okay, we have the next rhythm pattern here, and you're probably like, whoa, this looks easy. But what is that? Well, that is a tie. And ties tie notes together. So you could tie these together, and they would tie their note values together. So if we had these 4 beats here, they would be counted like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, and that would continue over there. Now your question, I know what it is already, maybe, if you're thinking real deeply about this, is why not just use a half note right here? And you totally could. You could just go 1, 2, 3, make that a half note. But here, this is where the ties really come into play, because you can't make a half note between the end of this measure, beat 4, and beat 1. It just doesn't exist like that. So we have to tie them together. So I'm playing this measure and this measure coming into here. It's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's almost like putting a half note in between those measures, and you're almost delaying this beat on until beat 2, 3, 4, which actually does create another type of syncopation, which is where you're taking the beat and just shifting it over from where you would expect it to. And in our Maple Leaf Rag, we have a tie in this measure right here. And you're going to notice that when I get to that measure, we're going to hit that beat on the 1 and 2 on the second and of beat 2, second half of beat 2, but we're going to hold it over, which is going to give a different type of sound. So let me play it without the tie first, and then I'll play it with the tie. See, it had that kind of double note in there without the tie, but here's with the tie. And it just kind of like created this kind of like off-kilter type of sound, similar to what we found over here, where you had the 8th quarter type of rhythm. So watch out for those ties, making sure that you are tying those note values together. Okay, I get this question a surprising amount, even though I don't think it's difficult. But the question usually I get is, what if you have 16th notes in the right hand, 8th notes in the left hand, or you have 8th notes in the right hand and 16th notes in the left hand? It's very easy. So we have 16th notes in the measure, right? We'll just focus on that one for right now. We have 16th notes. Therefore, we have to subdivide the entire thing. And again, we're going to be lining these up in vertical columns, and that makes it easier to tell which part of the beat the 8th notes fall under. So here's the entire measure written out. So maybe the problem is more of a coordination thing than anything, but you can see that the ones line up with the ones, the ands line up with the ands, the twos line up with the twos, the ands line up with the ands. I think you get the idea. So it might be a coordination problem students are having, right? 1E and 2E and 3E and 4E and The way I got it right is really honing in, maybe putting a little bit of an accent on one and, or the number and then the and. 1 and, let me do it here. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, or counted the whole thing. 1E and 2E and 3E and 4E and. I call that the attack point. You're really focusing on the point of attack. Now, when you're playing it in the context of a piece, maybe you wouldn't have the accents so prominent there. But when you're first figuring this out with the coordination, I like to just kind of emphasize one over the other. This is the opposite. 1E and 2E and 3E and 4E and. It's just that you're bouncing on this one a little bit more. Bump, 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 bump. So if you think about it, you have two 16th notes for every quarter note or 8th note you have in your right hand. So it's double timed from one hand to the other. Okay, we got to talk about something I call partial ties. This is rhythm pattern number 8, I believe. Now, we just talked about ties, pretty easy concept, right? At least for a lot of us. This is where it's going to get everybody. So here we have this piece, what is this? Evening in the Country by Bartók. I played this in a piece recently, in a lesson recently that we did. I think, what is it? The seven pieces between beginner and intermediate. Check out that lesson. But anyways, and once we're done, of course. One thing I want to tell you about or show you about is right here. See how right here, where I have it circled, there is a tie in the middle of that circle, obviously. And there's something suspicious about it, something you really got to be on the lookout for, because if you're not, you're going to get it wrong. And what I'm talking about, of course, is the fact that there's no tie down here. So these notes are not tied, only the first note is tied. I'm telling you right now that 99.9% of students are going to do this when they go to play this measure. Oops, let me try again. Did you pick out the mistake? Well, I didn't hold over that tied note. I just played it again, and I'm telling you 99% of you will get that. You got to watch out for these, I call them partial ties. Only part of the chord is tied over. So here's how you should play it. Keeping that thumb stationary over that D. So the important point is just make sure that when you're looking at ties, not all the notes are always tied over, and sometimes within a hand, you have to really determine what notes am I holding over and what notes are actually changing. Okay, we only have one more rhythm pattern to go over, and then we have a bonus tip at the end. Before we get to that, I just want to take a quick second to say thank you so much to all those that have supported the channel over the years, from the mods to the regular viewers to the channel members, and to those that have purchased courses over on my website, pianolessonsontheweb.com. Just want to take a second to say thank you so much. We wouldn't have been able to reach as many students as we've had or be online this long. So thank you so much. On with the lesson. Okay, this is the last rhythm. And again, I have a bonus tip at the end, as usual. As they say that. All right, what are we doing here? We got 16th notes, but we got these weird things. In fact, it reminds me, we probably should have talked a little bit more about rests today, but maybe that'll be another rhythm pattern lesson. But anyway, we got rests in between here, and these specifically are 16th note rest. A 16th note rest is like a 16th note, except you don't play, okay? And there's a way you got to think about this to get it right. And I think the first step, what do you think the first step should be? To jump around and spin around in a circle real fast and get dizzy? No, the thing we need to do is chart out our rhythms like we always do with the 1E and a 2E and a type of thing. So let's do that instead. I want to say real quick that all 4 of our beats actually happen on the rest. Kind of odd. So we've charted out our 16th note subdivisions. Let's make that nice and big that you can see it. Okay, now this is how we're doing this, right? You're going to count 1 and then go E and a 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a. I got a little bit off there. Let me try a few more times. This is actually trickier than it seems. It really is. 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a. Got it. So the key really is that, remember, I was talking about points of attack before, and almost the point of attack is on the rest. So it's like 1 E, 2 E, and 3 E, and 4 E, and you really just got to think about where are you moving, like what syllable are you playing the next note on, and it's always that E, right? 1 E and 2 E and. So I really am actually focusing on the E. 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E, just like that. So as I promised you, I actually have a bonus tip here at the end. And actually the bonus tip is that there's a whole new set of rhythm patterns you need to become aware of. I actually have a few lessons on this now. Maybe I'll combine them into a mega compilation at some point. Let me know if you want that. Anyway, what I want to tell you though is this. You want to watch this lesson next right here. It's the 9 rhythm patterns beginners always mess up, and I know that you're messing them up too. It's been your piano teacher, Tim, here. Thanks for coming, and I'll see you in the next lesson.